Let's go ahead and get started. And let's start with a prayer. Haley, there are handouts on the table right as you walk in. And let's pray this prayer at the top, shaded in gray, together. We give you thanks, most gracious God, for the beauty of the earth and sky and sea, for the richness of mountains, plains, and rivers, for the songs of the birds and the loveliness of flowers. We praise you for these good gifts and pray that we may safeguard them for our posterity. Grant that we may continue to grow in our grateful enjoyment of your abundant creation to the honor and glory of your name, now and forever. Amen. Adeline, did you make that prayer up or did you pull it from a resource?
It's from the good old BCP.
The BCP. Is it really? You never know what you'll find in that Book of Common Prayer. Well, welcome. This is our last in this series, and I've gotten some good feedback. I've really enjoyed the intersection of theology and practicality and both corporate and individual responsibility. I really appreciate the way Adeline has structured each of our weeks, offering some open-ended theological reflections at the end. This is our fourth week. Last week, of course, we had our Tippy McMichael lecture panel when we heard about justice reform in Arkansas. If you weren't here last week, go see it on the YouTube channel. It was good work both Saturday night and also Sunday morning. Today we're looking at the topic of dominion. So to remind you, we looked at topics of water, of land, of food, and now we're looking at the broad concept of dominion, and we'll get to that in more detail in a minute. Next week is Celebration Sunday, big celebration breakfast. We do not have formation next week. Instead, we're gathering for a longer, more enjoyable, relaxed breakfast. But then the following week, I'm going to begin a 3-week series on collects, that form of prayer that is essential to our identity as Anglicans. And we'll look at the form of collects. How are they written? Why are they written? And we'll even practice writing some of our own. So a 3-week series on collects. That starts 2 weeks from today. But let's start with this reading from Genesis and then one from Psalm 8. And let's get two different voices, if we may. Who would read for us, please, the Genesis reading using the microphone that Adeline will bring to you? Who would read the Genesis reading? Thank you, Dave. And Tammy, would you be willing to read the Psalm 8 reading after he's done with that one? Thank you. One after the other, and Dave will get you that microphone, or Adeline will. Thanks, Dave.
Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth."
Thank you, Dave. And now Psalm 8. Tammy.
O Lord, our sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. Out of the mouths of babes and infants, you have founded a bulwark because of your foes, to silence the enemy and the avenger. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, what are human beings that you are mindful of them? Mortals that you care for them. Yet you have made them a little lower than God and crowned them with glory and honor. You have given them dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under their feet, all sheep and oxen, and also the beasts of the field, the birds of the air, the fish of the sea, whatever passes along the paths of the seas. O Lord, our sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth.
Thank you. Thank you both. All right, let's start with what you notice. Let's trust that there's a holiness to noticing. And I'm curious, what do you notice in these two passages? And if you're coming in, we're really glad that you're here. Get some coffee. And if you want a handout, they're on the other table right there. Good to see y'all. What do you notice in these two passages? What catches your eye or your ear today? And Adeline will bring you the microphone so that those participating online can hear your comments too. What do you notice? It never fails that the person who wants to speak first is on the opposite side of the room as the microphone. That's what keeps us on our toes, literally.
So the hierarchy that's in play here, God, man, animals.
God, man, animals. Yeah, and where would you put angels in that? Are there angels in there too? Maybe there aren't. Yeah, somewhere in between. Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah. The hierarchy. Yeah, thank you. What else? What else do you notice? Yeah, all the other side, yeah. Come on in, get a handout from the table here across from the coffee pot and join us. Tammy, what do you see?
I see that in the Genesis reading, it's God speaking. In Psalm 8, it's the human speaking.
Yeah.
And when God's speaking, he's telling humans, he says, let's make humankind in our image according to our likeness. They can have dominion over everything. Of course, God's idea of dominion is most likely quite different from our idea of dominion.
Uh-huh.
And then in Psalm 8, it's a human speaking about how majestic God is and why in the world would you give all this to humans?
Yes, thank you. And you begin to get at the reason we chose these passages, which are traditional passages that talk about dominion. They even have the word dominion in it. But the question we want to ask as we finish our series on creator and created is, what does that mean? And is our understanding of dominion different from what perhaps God, and even different from perhaps what the ancients had in mind? Yeah. What else do you notice? Yeah, Karen.
Both of these passages give man dominion or power over the animals, wild animals and domesticated animals. They are under our feet, but there's no mention of any obligation to the animals.
Yes. Thank you. Something missing. Yeah, Tammy.
Perhaps in God's definition of dominion, responsibility and obligation are all wrapped up in that dominion. And as you mentioned, the ancients' idea of dominion, and even our own in this day and age, may not have included the idea of obligation and responsibility.
Yeah.
I see that indigenous peoples world over have innately had that sense of responsibility and obligation to care for the earth and all its creatures.
Yeah.
Whereas it's the European view of things, it's quite different.
Yeah. We'll hear about that in the sermon today. If you haven't been to church yet, you'll hear a little bit about that colonizing tendency. Absolutely. Let's use that as a pivot to the subject of dominion more generally, whether drawn from this text or from other experience or insights. What does dominion mean? And think about, let's just start with that, and then I'll say some things about the language. But when you hear dominion, what does that bring to mind? What's the context, and what's the implication and the execution of that? Yeah, Haley.
Dominion means that you have to make decisions on behalf of them, and you have to make good enough decisions that your goals are met.
Yeah.
As the king or whoever, the dominating one.
Yeah. I hear you using dominating one, of course, dominion, same bit. You also throw in king, and something about making decisions on behalf of and instrumentally involving others to help you achieve your goals. And maybe there's a question about whether your goals are good or not. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. What else? When you hear dominion, what do you think of? Yeah, Shannon.
Well, the other word that's in here is subdue. And that definitely, put your
Subdue.
thumb on right.
Yeah, we could have a whole, subdue. We could have a whole class on subdue, right? Domestication. I mean, domestication, dominion, subdue, those are all tied up. Yeah, thank you. What else? One other take? When you hear dominion, what do you think of? Yeah, Ray?
Well, in Psalm 8, verse 2, it looks like there's an element of protection, protecting babes and infants from our enemies and avengers.
Yes, which I have to dig a little further to see because my Western-trained eye and ear fall to different sections than that implication. But I want to come back to the psalmist identifying God's role as to protect God's people from their foes. And maybe what does that tell us about not only the nature of God's dominion, but our dominion? Dominion, dominus, Latin, Lord, lordship. A domain, right? The one who's in charge of a domain. Those have Latin sort of roots. The Hebrew is different. If only we had someone in the room who knew Hebrew who might be able to tell us a little bit more about Radah and Mashal. And I wonder if, I don't know, I'm asking, I wonder if, as Tammy asked earlier, whether those words, the Hebrew, Radah and Mashal, carry anything other than lordship authority. Does anybody, I don't want to put Ray on the spot, but does anybody know whether those words, I didn't do that word study. Yeah, that's right. So let's acknowledge that there are different layers of meaning, as Tammy invites us to see. Some of that is linguistically isolating. But in addition to the linguistic questions, which are important, there's also the question of context. And I want you to think about my 14-year-old daughter, whose name is Frances. Frances sometimes babysits for other families in our neighborhood, and sometimes she watches our children at home when Elizabeth and I are gone. If I say to Frances, in front of her siblings, Frances, you are in charge, that carries a very different context than if the parent of someone else's children says, you're in charge, because Frances's relationship with their children is very different from her relationship with her siblings. So when the oldest sibling hears that she is in charge of her brothers and sisters, there's a bit of lordship, there's a bit of dominion, rule, authority, subdue, and it's easier in my mind when I'm babysitting for someone else to hear the responsibility and the charge that come through that word, and how it's the same function, it's the same person, it's the same moment, and yet the context completely changes that. And that's true for babysitting, but isn't that also true? Is it also true depending on what we are in charge of, what we have lordship over, what we have dominion over? So to begin to wonder that, kind of the coming around, and I want to save time for the other two exercises we've got. So let me skip to the sort of that last, sort of the second and last question. So how do we step back from our assumptions about dominion and read back into this text something that not only provides a fuller approach, but also doesn't restrict our understanding of who God is and what God asks of us based on that colonialist, I'm in charge of my siblings mentality. Like, think about it with me. If God says to humankind, have dominion over the earth, and we hear those words as our ship is sailing into the new world and we are ready to conquer, our understanding of who we are and who the people in front of us are and who God is very different than if we hear that word as we're being asked to tend someone's garden while they're away on vacation. So just join me in imagining not only how our role is different, but how clearly that begins to change the way we think of God and how consequential that is. If we only let people who make their business, their wealth, their prosperity by subduing other people and other places, if we only let them tell us who God is, that changes the way we hear God for generations. And how do we spin that? Angela, yeah, thank you.
This is a fantastic question that I'm actually actively working on elsewhere in the world. So, if we start this story at 126, we get the God, like a straight line down, like God, maybe angels are somewhere in there, humans, creation, animals, land, whatever. But which gets to this dominion, very patriarchal, like lordship, dominion dominated in all the ways that we've already named. But if we see this in the context of the fuller first creation story, it's a little different than what we all may have seen and heard and thought about for like the whole time we're thinking about creation and how creation happens. So God says like, there was nothing, or there's chaos, and then the Spirit moves over the deep. Well, the Spirit is this ruach, which is a feminine word. So if you've got this idea of a masculine God, and like the way that I think we've all been taught is there is a God, whatever God's gender is, up for debate, but that there's this masculine warrior God power that controls things. But if you look at the first part of the Genesis creation narrative, it is a feminine power that separates the darkness and the light. It's the feminine earth that creates the plants. And there's feminine, the water is kind of a funky gendered situation. But there's these feminine and neuter powers that are a part of this creation. So if we can go back a little farther and we see a little bit more expansively, then this dominion is not the straight line hierarchy is not the only way to see creation and how power is distributed. To recognize that that God uses all these other different things that are existing to create and to continue to create. And so how can we get away from a dominion hierarchy situation to more of an accompanying, co-laboring, co-creating with God, with each other, with the earth, that I think gets us closer to the kingdom of God on earth.
Yeah, thank you. Let's let Tammy go, and then I'm going to ask Adeline to come forward and lead us in the next bit. Tammy.
Carrying that line of thought a little bit, in the creation stories of many, many indigenous peoples and First Peoples and First Nations, their creation story is not a top-down kind of thing. Theirs is an earthly and up. They came out of the ground and witnessed the glory of creation. After God created it, after the Spirit created all this wonderful awesomeness, then the people came up out of the ground and out of the earth. So rather than top down European, it's bottom up.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, and as Angela points out, that's not foreign to our tradition either. We just, people like me have been the ones choosing which verses we read. And that's not fair. And honestly, it takes a while to read all of Genesis 1. It takes time to read Genesis 1 through 2-4. But if we're not reading the whole story, we're missing that. We've got to hold them together, which I appreciate that invitation. Tammy, one follow-up?
It's part of our humankind evolution. And the United Nations in November, late this month and in November, it has a conference in Edinburgh, what's it called? The COP26, which is all about all of this caring for the planet. And a very good friend of ours is in charge of a piece of that with the caring for the oceans. So we've been following that, and it is fantastic. Look it up, COP26.
Thank you. Adeline?
Yeah? Okay. If you flip your paper over, you'll see on the top this street sign that says wildflowers do not mow. How many of y'all have seen a sign like that? I always love encountering those signs on the side of a highway. And it always makes me curious. One, I love wildflowers, so I have a special spot in my heart for those and the things that protect them. But it always makes me wonder why wildflowers are seen differently than other plants or weeds. They share a lot of similarities to those things that we would call weeds, and when taken out of their native context, can be invasive. So it sort of warrants this question that I've put on here. Some natural beauties and resources are protected. Why? And what does that tell us about those particular resources? Why are wildflowers? Why do they warrant this sign, but normal grass doesn't? Or
Lou
a
says
field
the
of
bees.
clover.
Lou says the bees.
The bees? Yeah, we got to protect those pollinators. Here in the middle.
Many wildflowers are annuals, and if we cut them before they go to seed, there won't be any more next year.
I think what my wife would say is wildflowers are pleasing to the eye and weeds are not.
I think it goes back to what we know about ecosystems and how the world at large works. And we know that certain things are necessary and we have to keep them or other things fall apart.
Yeah. Yeah, all about ecosystems. And if you remove one piece of that system, things start to fall apart. It's true.
For me, the word wildflower is all about branding. I think people have learned that the word wildflower means something positive and beautiful, but if you call the same plant a weed, which you can if it's out of context, you can easily mow it down. And this is where, going back to the other conversation, I think there's an economic aspect of this, that the way you articulate something is a way to convince people towards action. So if you want people to go and colonize and take over, then you talk about their right to dominion, and you call them all weeds, and it's easier to mow them and take care of them and control them. But if they're wildflowers, that's harder to wipe out.
Some really good marketing. That is, of course, part of it. And something I also heard in there, which is the next thing I've written, is that wildflowers are also native and sort of counteract that colonial understanding of dominion. Go ahead.
So I read this as wildflowers sort of can't take care of themselves somehow, and they need help. So don't mow them.
Can they not take care of themselves, or does our trying to take care of them mess things up? You could read it either way.
Yeah, that was my question. They can't take care of themselves, or they can't. We humans, with our dominion over the earth, have not created the situation and systems for them to survive as they have forever and ever. And then we can get into the ethics of lawn care and grass and what's a weed and what's not a weed and how we use our resources. But we can keep going.
We could take that really far in terms of plant life, animal life, other humans. We could really have a long conversation about exactly this. I noticed that hunters and fishermen have a particularly keen sense of this sort of limitation on dominion. There are limits to how many animals you can kill. There's limits on how many fish you can bring back. I'm curious if we have hunters and fishermen in the room who might want to comment on that delicate balance.
Do you want to comment?
My dad, I don't hunt or fish, but my dad does, and he finds it so important that he wants to protect a lot of land, like more than you would think, so that he can still enjoy it and other people can still enjoy it for a long time. And some people might think that land could be developed, and he says, well, if it stayed the same, then we get to enjoy it this way.
Mm-hmm.
And there's like a tension there.
Yeah, there's a definite tension point between how we make use of land, what is helpful use of land, what is overusing the land, and that affects the wildlife there too.
There continues to be an ongoing tension in the Bureau of Land Management and national parks and control of our shared natural resources in our own country, because there are ranchers and developers and timber and miners and all that want to take resources out and use up the land rather than protect it. So there's that tension, it's so much so that many longtime ranchers, not all of them, but many longtime ranchers consider it their land, their right to graze their cattle on the land.
Yeah, land ownership also becomes tricky. Yeah.
I want to add another tension of what land we protect and how and why, including the Bureau of Land Management with our national parks and the wildfires that are happening, because it's been let's protect this, let's keep it safe, but that has led to not allowing the natural fires that need to occur to clear out the brush, so that now when they're happening, as the earth continues to warm and all the other big global things, it leads to more devastating fires because we didn't listen to more of the indigenous practices of let the fires clear it out, because fire is not always a bad thing. But what we do about that now and going forward is a question lots of people have that I don't have the answer to.
The couple questions I have at the end of this section, I'm curious on your thoughts. Of course, there's certain pieces of land we've protected, there's certain species we've protected, and numbers of those species that are protected. Do those feel like things that should apply in other areas of our life? And that doesn't have to mean legally apply. It could mean a personal principle of not using all of something. What's your take on that? How do we think about these things in parts of our life that we do have a little more control over? It's a big question.
Well, one of the things we can do with some of these kind of basic teachings, like don't mow the wildflowers, is we can generalize them and apply them to other situations. That's certainly our responsibility to interpret that and do it. It's part of our co-creation with God.
I would say that it's like a springboard. Like we have to unlearn some of our relationship, or unlearn some of our kind of perceptions and around our paradigms around control. Like even when we're trying to protect, we protect to the point of submission, And so how do we create in every little way a relationship with the earth? Like how do we really get to know? And we were listening to, I had a speaker come in, Kelsey Leonard. She's a Shinnecock Nation leader, and she was asking the question, she's been asking this question about who is water? Like changing our questions, changing our language to be around who is water, instead of how do we manage the water, which is a control and manage perspective, but what does the water need today? And which sounds so in our kind of English that we use, very strange. But that's kind of the direction that I would say, even in our own yard or our own balcony or wherever we are, like, how do we create relationship? And I think we have a lot of practice to do in that.
I like the way you articulated that.
Couple of things. I'd rather not mow my yard. You know, talking about not mowing the wildflowers. I'd like to seed my entire front yard in wildflowers. But city code right now would not allow me to do that because the neighbors would see the transition as maybe not necessarily a pretty thing. You know, as I transition it from what I consider ugly is the lawn to a more prairie state. But it's something I'm working on. And thank you. Another thing, where'd I go with that thought?
We're going to switch to our next piece, but I know we'll come back to some of these thoughts at the end as we think about how we respond to all of this.
As we transition, I want you to think about ask yourself if it would feel any different if that sign said, "Wildflowers, do not pick." And for whose sake are the wildflowers, right? Is it for everyone who drives by? If you picking it would rob the next car or pedestrian from seeing it? Is that the reason? Or what happens if we stop thinking about creation as instrumental to our ends, but of value in itself? And what kind of concept of dominion do we need to recover in order to stop thinking about how can we make these useful for me, and instead, how can we be a shepherd or how can we be responsible for something for its own sake? Maybe that's about governing me rather than governing it. Adeline and I wanted to find a poem that would kind of begin to tease out a different approach to dominion and creation, and we found one from our own Max Sutton. Y'all know Max Sutton, member of our parish, Max Sinclair. And it's from this particular volume of his poems, Taking Was All I Had to Give. And it's a poem called Crazy Bird. I actually saw Max and Claire on Thursday afternoon. And I said, "Max, we're planning on reading one of your poems in class. Is that okay?" And he said, "Read them all," which was just great. Anyway, so generous. But when I told him about this, he said, maybe somebody will be there who thinks of themselves as from the Ozarks. He said, this poem needs to be read with that Ozark accent. And he said, I know Frank Sharp won't be there, but if Frank Sharp was there, hand him the microphone and let him read it. Regardless of who reads it, let's hear it as if it were spoken on a small piece of land somewhere in the undulated Ozark Mountains. Tammy, would you read it for us? Tammy's going to read it for us. Thank you.
I'll try to shift from my Texas twang to more Ozarkian. The Crazy Bird. Tied to the mule with long lines looped around his waist, Dad kept on plowing sandstone, dead roots, and little loam high on the mountain, while Crazy Bird in sumac bloom or sassafras outdid the mockingbird, bursting from thickets with squawks and flip-flops, maniacal outcries, raising a ruckus. Dad straddled a furrow, not the saddle horse he used to ride, keeping a grip on plow handles, rib breakers if he let them slip. Sweat stung his eyes, soaked the bib and galluses of his blue overalls, while the yellow-breasted chat, the Crazy Bird, flitted and flashed and jerked in midair, flaunting his ecstasy against Dad's harness trudge. Did he mind, I wondered, this clown cutting dittos while he walked the furrow? No, he said, when he stopped for water. A crazy bird made real good company. He took another lukewarm sip and screwed the lid back on the fruit jar. No man, he said, would ever grudge a bird his courting time.
Thank you, Tammy. Responses to that. Can you hear the tension in the poem? What does that draw out of you? What's your response to that poem? Haley.
It's dominion, but also enjoyment. I mean, he is plowing up the ground, but he still enjoys that bird, even though it's not part of the crop that's going to be.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, it's been a while since we read it, but you know, the story of the people of Israel moving into the land of Canaan, the fulfillment of that promise has a lot to do with agriculture and has a lot to do with the transition of society from nomadic hunter-gatherer society to an agrarian society, in some ways the definition of civilization. And so some of the tensions that we read woven into the stories of Scripture live right here in that strange way where we're subduing the earth and yet trying to appreciate what's going on around us. Sometimes when what's going on around us is in fact impeding or in conflict with it. How do we hold that? Yeah, thank you. What else?
I recently, when I was taking the trash out one night, it was dark, and I went to go grab the trash can, and something jumped on my leg, and I was terrified, and I screamed for all my neighbors to hear. It was a frog that jumped all over me. I freaked out. And I wonder what it would have been like if I had had Max's generosity in thinking about these creatures. The frog was in his house, hanging out under my trash can, and I disturbed him, but was perfectly angry with said frog. I just wonder, well, I know that I could be more generous with creation around me, but I want to hold this poem in mind as I encounter nature.
Yeah, thank you. Tammy. And after Tammy, I'm going to ask Adeline to come and finish.
In the poem, Dad plowing the furrows sees a crazy bird in a courting time, courting. But from my knowledge of field larks and meadowlarks, the crazy bird might have been protecting a nest, that was in the furrows. Because that's what meadowlarks do. If you get close to their nest, they'll do all kind of crazy things.
Yeah.
I thought of my thought before. When Europeans came over to subdue the so-called New World and subdue the indigenous peoples and had this crazy idea that these indigenous peoples were like children, and they had the idea of, these are my siblings and I'm older than them and I can take care of them and give them religion and all that crap. While the indigenous people were just astonished at the arrogance, because the indigenous people were fully formed humans. And they were like, we don't need taken care of. We got this under control. And yet, we all know what happened.
Yeah, thank you. And as Adeline comes forward, just to think about the ways in which our stories of Scripture reflect that tendency to infantilize the other. And yet, that isn't always how God sees us. I wonder how we might redeem that. Yeah, thank you.
As we've done every week of this series, our final piece is to think about our response to what we've discussed together and the theological reflection we've done together. So I wonder if we have maybe even a more concretized definition of dominion now that we've talked together for most of an hour about this word. We had some thoughts swirling around at the beginning. I wonder if there's any more formalized thoughts in the room right now.
Well, I think what is sobering is in the mid-20th century, we developed the ability to destroy human life and most higher life forms with nuclear weapons. And pretty much along the same time frame, probably starting maybe 100 years earlier, we began to develop the idea of ecosystem. And so, to me, what it means to have dominion is to have an understanding of systems. And I found in today's liturgy, Almighty God, to you all hearts are open, all desires known, and from you no secrets are hid. And I was thinking of myself as an emotional system, and many of the desires and secrets that I have are unknown to myself even, and so I need a better system of psychology, and I need a better system of dominion over the physical world and also myself. And it has a scientific, rational, empirical, evidentiary component to it, but underneath that is the mystery of why there is anything at all, and I wish to leave the world a better place than it was when I was born into it.
This will not be so deep, but the other word that, I mean, it has been brought up briefly, but stewardship, and we've talked about that in the other classes as well, and I think if dominion could be replaced by stewardship, you know, God created us and everything, therefore we need to take care of God's creation, and that seems to be the underlying message in Genesis, I think, but it gets lost. I mean, dominion's it definitely skews it to subdue, rule over, lord over, in control, which none of us are in control. So, I don't know, going back to it, it's a mutual, us and them, creation, created, we're all in this together, take care of it.
The never-ending struggle of Bible translation, both across languages and across time. A perfectly reasonable English translation in one era can mean something totally different in another. The next question that I think would be interesting for us to think about is, God gives us dominion way at the beginning of creation, but we've sort of interpreted that in a way that benefits us. I wonder if we think in the purest sense of dominion, what does this offering say about our relationship with God? God trusts us with this role in creation. What does that mean for us? What does that mean about our full relationship with God, not just that piece of it?
I think that it means that we are trustworthy, and we can discern ways to take care of the earth in the way that God intended. God put us in charge because God believes in us.
I think if we look through history, we'll see a continuum where in the beginning there were very few humans and lots of animals. And we were given dominion over them, and we used them to our benefit. We used their bones, their skin, their meat. We became more and more plentiful, more and more numerous, and we have subdued the earth. And now we are taking steps to protect animals. We have rare and endangered species and lists, and we, raised condors from eggs to make sure that we would save them. We have too many deer now because not enough people hunt for deer. I wonder if humans became endangered, if any species would step up and say, oh, we have to preserve some of these.
It's an interesting question.
When I was 9 years old, I decided to be a vegetarian because I thought God said eating meat and killing animals was against my 9-year-old ethics. And then I read Genesis 1:26. And I said, oh, God gave us all these animals so that we could eat them. Well, I can't be a vegetarian anymore. So that time of being a vegetarian lasted about 9 days. I'm now in like year 6 of being a vegetarian for longer because I have also changed my way of reading the Bible. That is not a literal way of reading the Bible. But I wonder how we can have a more expansive and creative relationship with each other, with creation, in a way that is not dictated as a like, check this box and this thing will happen. I mean, I think we're very actively living in watching the consequences of the climate crisis, and have to take it very seriously. But how can we be a little bit more creative and a little bit more discerning about how God is calling us to act in a way that is not a dominating way, but is in a more cooperative way.
In our last couple of minutes, I would love for us to do one of these fill in the blanks that's on the bottom. I'm curious how you might answer that last one. My relationship with God teaches me to care for the earth in these ways. Some concrete things that you might take from this conversation. I'm leaving with more questions than answers, which I think is really healthy and wonderful. I've enjoyed this conversation. But I know that I also need some of those tangible things to walk away with.
For myself, it's going to involve becoming more politically active in my community, to maybe work with changing city code about some things formerly mentioned.
Working on that prairie land in your front yard.
Alan Osner has converted his yard to a prairie here in Fayetteville. He might have some recommendations of who to talk to.
You can have a sustainable yard, so in Fayetteville, but you have to like show different things. But I know that exists. But there's a lot of other work also that needs to be done. I'll just say that I think that my relationship with God teaches me to care with the earth. I think it's that relationship with God and kind of just like connecting with the Spirit. I think that there's something bigger than me, and having that sense that this ridiculousness for me that I could have control over something like that. I feel like it's more about connecting with the Spirit and feeling the Spirit of all things, and I think that's what this makes me think of is connecting at that, and that helps me then care in a way that's more relational.
I think this might be our last comment, Haley. So make it good.
Gosh, I'm so sorry because my comment is that I feel like I'm taking away from this that I am middle management and not the CEO. So I think that just says a lot about my mindset in general. But there is someone else that I have to listen to in order to manage the earth.
Yeah, I love that image. Thank y'all. This has been a delight these past 4 weeks, and I feel like today in particular has left me with a lot to think about. So I hope you'll keep pondering some of these things too.